Helen O'Carroll is going to talk to us about lobbying legislation. Obviously, interest groups exist. Part of the job of the state should be to regulate the influence of such groups and to make sure that they behave in appropriate ways and that they don't have disproportionate effects on policy making. So I think it's lobbying and policy making you want to look at.
Sort of, yeah, it's sort of that. It's looking at interest groups probably in a more formal way than Sandra did. And so I got interested in looking at was just two changes in how we or how our lobbying or interest groups would be dealt with in the context of policy making, and that's the introduction of the lobbying legislation this year and the lobbying register, which came into effect on the 1st of September. And at the same time, since the Local Government Reform Act of last year, there's changes there that have put into place a more formal framework for public participation in the decision-making process at local level. So, you know, it looks like we're getting a handle on this, recognising the power of interest groups and accepting that they have a role in shaping policy and coming to grips with ways of controlling it and harnessing that power as well. But I just felt that this is only one half of the story, and you know, you really can't talk about the power of interest groups unless you also at the same time talk about the policy that they're trying to influence and the policy making process, and finally the policy makers themselves. And really, these two new developments, I think, are very welcome and they're very positive steps. But I feel that something has to happen, something has to shift amongst the policymakers themselves if these two new changes are to have any great effect. And I think it's not too much of an overstatement to say that policy making in Ireland has hardly gone through a golden age in the last 20 years. And the head of the RSI in 2012, Frances Ruane, outlined some of the failings in policy making in that period. She said policy was dominated by the programme for government. And I'm quoting from her now, "Major policy issues were decided in settings where there was great pressure to obtain consensus and huge media attention. The focus was on the decision-making process in terms of the winners and the losers at the expense of the content of the agreement. Some policy decisions didn't involve the policymakers at all, and their role in the process was simply to implement and to evaluate." Excuse me. And she also pointed out I think we're all familiar with this, the over-reliance on the use of consultants' reports, and reports which, you know, quite often had terms of reference which ensured that the outcome would be virtually predetermined. And there was the huge growth of state agencies between 1990 and 2008, which blurred the issue of where the responsibility for policy making lay, as a large number of the agencies developed considerable autonomy. There was, you know, the lack of specialist knowledge or resources to analyse and develop policy in government departments, and this led to the low use of research in policy making. And Ruane, she believes that this was down to our poor respect for and knowledge of statistics. And you know, we all prefer to hear anecdotal evidence rather than statistical evidence. And let's face it, statisticians aren't exactly the greatest at putting forward their information in digestible fashion. And she summed up that attitude with the observation that the comment, "I don't deal with statistics, I deal with real people," is often uttered with pride, but in reality it means, "I don't deal with real people, I deal with a few people I know." And so that's the context of policy making, and my fear is that really hasn't changed at all. But on the other side, if you look at, let's say, the formal engagement with interest groups, there's the introduction of the lobbying legislation and the register. And Brendan Howlin, who is the minister who brought this legislation in, he says, "Extensive communication is the essence of good policy making. The commencement of lobbying regulation is introduced to support the information channels between the political system, the public service, and all sectors of society. Public servants should continue to be open to approaches from the widest range of interests in society." So if you go, and the lobbying register has only been open since the 1st of September, so there's only about 9 or 10 groups have registered. But so far, I just had a quick look last week, Rowing Ireland had a meeting with Pascal Donoghue regarding the funding for the 2016 sports budget to try and encourage a higher level of investment in sport. North Connacht's Youth and Community Service had a meeting with the Department of Children and Youth Affairs to highlight low levels of funding and the resource implications of that. A group called My Legacy Limited had a meeting with Minister of State Damien English to secure funding for their objective to encourage people to make a will and consider a gift to a favourite charity. Now, that's all very laudable and public-spirited. I mean, there's no sinister or dangerous cabals to be found there. And according to Helen, the legislation will allow the wider public to reach information-based judgments about the extent to which different interest groups are accessing key decision makers across the political and public service systems. The existence of this register will help to support a more transparent and balanced stakeholder engagement by shining a light on who is talking to whom. Which sounds great, but is the light shining on all of the conversations? I mean, opinion and policy making, all that, formed in a myriad of different ways, and is a complex process. So it's not necessarily through one formal meeting that policy is decided. And we're all very aware of how small this country is, and there isn't even 1 degree of separation, not to mind 6. And, you know, you'd have to ask, will the light shine on, for instance, Druids Glen, as Pat pointed out this morning? Let's say you're the Taoiseach and you are playing your golf in Druids Glen with titans of the banking world. And, you know, the light won't shine there, but even like it has done in the last, over the course of the summer, the light won't tell you what's being said. So if you want to insist that the conversation was about the price bullocks made at Tullamore Mart last week, you're quite free to do so, because the onus in the lobbying legislation falls slowly on the lobbyer. The lobbyee doesn't have to provide a matching report, which, unlike in the European Commission, where they introduced new rules last December so that the commissioners, members of their cabinets and directors general have to publish information about meetings held with lobbyists. So while the lobbying legislation register are a good thing, but they won't eradicate all the means by which some interest groups influence policy. So it'll be a bit like, I think, drug testing in the sports world, you know, where we've athletes who are clean because they're not being tested for the correct drug. Or maybe it's more like the flu vaccine, which doesn't always match the actual strain of flu that it targets. Because whichever interest group wants to get its way badly enough, it will find an entry point that won't be detected by the lobbying register. I think that's fairly clear. And the other sort of uncomfortable truth there is that small, unrepresentative groups are always more likely to form than larger ones which reflect the interests of bigger numbers of people. And this was articulated in 1965 by an American economist, Mansur Olson, in a book called The Logic of Collective Action, where he pointed out that the greater the number of individuals who share an interest in a collective good, the less likely it is that a group will form to pursue it, because narrow, self-serving groups have an inherent advantage over broad ones. And so one of his illustrations was, let's say, 5 car companies who could be induced to form a lobbying group much more easily because they would gain significantly from price increases or government subsidies. But organising 5 million drivers to fight back is much harder because each driver could hope for a free ride on the back of others, so none had much to gain by joining the group. And in 2000, Garrett Fitzgerald concurred with this, and he wrote that democratic national governments tend to be subject to such strong pressure from vested interests within their own territories that many of their decisions operate against the interests of society as a whole, which is a fairly depressing conclusion. But maybe the counterbalance is to be found in local government, where, as I say, under the changes in the Local Government Reform Act, have provided the basis for a formal engagement with the community. Now, there was the Community and Voluntary Forum before, but that's now changed to the Public Participation Network, or the PPN. The Local Government Reform Act has brought in, we're all drowning in acronyms in the county councils now as well as a result of it. But under the PPN, citizens and communities are encouraged and supported to take part in the decision-making process in the local authority. Individuals can join an existing group or organisation or set up their own and register it with the PPN and under the appropriate categories, which are social inclusion, environment and community and voluntary. And it's the main link now through which the local authority will connect with the community, and so policies, plans and programmes will go through this system for public consultation. And of course, like the lobbying register, it's a good thing and it's better to have it than not have it. But the PPN will really only work if you're genuinely interested in getting the community's points of view and not just doing it because you have to. And And this really is prompted by my own involvement in the development of two policies in Kerry County Council earlier in the year, one to do with the 2016 commemoration and the other on tourism. And in both cases, we were awash with public consultation. There was loads of it. And I'm also looking as well at the call for public participation in the new cultural policy, Culture 2025. And watching this system in action, both nationally and locally, what strikes me is I'm wondering if public servants critically, and all of this I'm saying as a public servant myself, so I'm criticising from the inside in, not from the outside. I'm just wondering, do public servants actually critically analyse beforehand what they're going out to public consultation with? I mean, do they really consider what they're asking the public to engage with? Because, stakeholder consultation is the phrase, obviously, that gets thrown around a lot, but I wonder, are people actually seen as that, as people who have a stake in how this plan or programme or policy is developed? Or is the stakeholder consultation just a box-ticking exercise and a tiresome process that needs to be gotten through and something to be put away and ignored until you need to hide behind it when things go wrong? We all know the line, we went to the public with this is what they wanted, so it's not our fault now that it's all gone horribly wrong. And I'm wondering as well, and once you go through the consultation process, whether public servants, and I mean the local government and national government as well, are properly equipped to deal with the results of the stakeholder consultation. Is the capacity there to deal with all the different viewpoints, to sift through, to analyse, to understand the difference between those who are making noise and those who are actually saying something of substance? I mean, I think it's not too wild a suggestion that in all of this, that we only listen to the familiar voices, the voices that we're used to hearing, because they're telling us what we want to hear. And I haven't seen in the two things that I was involved in much skill of discernment in the public participation process. So my conclusion, therefore, is that, that laudable and all as the new ways of dealing with interest groups are, they're not enough on their own to affect the substantial change in the policy-making process if we're not going to repeat, if that's necessary, that change in policy-making process that's necessary, if we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the past 20 years. And I think really the biggest change that's necessary is to have an honest look at the fear that always exists in public service, and one that I think has grown acute over the past 7 years or so, which is the fear of making decisions and taking responsibility for them. And unless we look at that, and without taking that fear out of its box and looking at it, I think it's very possible that these new ways of dealing with interest groups will just be new ways of not taking responsibility for anything. And that's it.
Thank you. You raised some really important issues there. I suppose looking at what kind of robust systems you can have to curb the power of interest groups or powerful individuals who may get more than their due from the state. I'm thinking, for example, of the planning systems we have here. It defies belief that planning permission was given for houses to be built on floodplains during our so-called boom. But nonetheless, it happened. And no one, to my knowledge, has really questioned the planners who made that decision, who are public servants and who are supposed to uphold robust systems of checks and balances about that. But at least on board Planola it does exist. Now, nobody was complaining to on board Planola about planning to build houses on floodplains because people were so desperate to get houses. Another part of the dysfunctionality of what happened in this country over the last 10 years. But at least it's there and sometimes can be accessed by citizens or small interest groups who have complaints about some planning decisions. Sean Fitzpatrick is sort of the ghost in the machine today. Pat Cook was very eloquent on him. I love the way he's called Shawnee Fitzpatrick, that lovely diminutive thing that we have for people who are powerful. And drummer, of course, Shawnee and drummer. John should write a song called Shawnee and Drummer, and I'm sure it would win the Eurovision Song Contest because nobody would believe the stuff these guys got up to. But the Druids Glen thing is, of course, now an iconic moment, and I just want to share something with you all, since we're already interested in Shawnee's existence outside jail, which is continuing remarkably. I had to give a lecture at the Greystones Golf Club, which is a very salubrious establishment, very nearly as nice as the Dunamay's Art Centre, just after the downfall of the said Shawnee Fitzpatrick. So at the lunch after my lecture, I asked some of the members of the golf club, does he still play here? As I knew he was a member. He lives down the road in Greystones. And they said, no, nobody will play with him. He can turn up with his golf clubs and we won't play. And I thought, that's very interesting. He's been blackballed from his local golf club. It'll be interesting now to see what's happened in Druids Glen, where he's obviously also a member. Has that happened there too? Or, as Pat, and I think rightly presupposed, said, is everything creeping back to what passed for normal during those dreadful years? When things went absolutely haywire. And are we going to think that all this is okay again? I don't know. But it says a lot. I mean, the issues that you raised about the lobbying legislation, how robust it can be or not, whether public servants really mean it when they talk about public consultation or not, is something we'll come back to in a while.